There were only 400 Al-Qaeda guys in the world in the fall of 2001, hiding out there with Bin Laden in the Nangarhar province. How's a group of bandits, a group of outlaws hiding out in the wilderness supposed to take on a superpower? And the answer is you infiltrate a special forces squad in there to do a big ass atrocity in order to convince that superpower to blow its own brains out, to convince that superpower to invade. As bin Laden's son, Omar, said, when Bush was elected, my father was so happy. He said, this is the kind of president he needs, one who will invade and spend money and break the country.
Osama said that to his son.
That's right. And his son told that to Rolling Stone magazine in 2010. You can read it. It's an interview with Omar bin Laden. He says, in Clinton's time, America was smart, not like the bull that runs after the red scarf. And then what happened? We invaded Afghanistan. We spent $10 trillion and lost anyway. And our empire has suffered greatly since.
Well, good to speak to you again. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. How are you?
Good, man. Good. Yeah. So not sure if you remember our last discussion. We spoke for an hour and a half, and it wasn't enough to. It was very high level as well. It wasn't enough to kind of go through the history of. We focused on the history after World War II, leading to kind of refresh your memory. And for the audience listening, highly recommend you search My Name is Scott's Name. Listen to part 1 of the interview. Scott is honestly one of my favorite people in breaking down U.S. foreign policy's history and how it led us to where we are today. So we talked about NATO's expansion, what led to the Ukraine war, and kind of pivoted to the Middle East through American support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan that became Al-Qaeda, to stretch Soviet thin, like kind of creating the South, creating the Vietnam for the Soviet. That was kind of the strategy there.
Mm-hmm.
And then we started talking about Middle East history, beginning with Iran, installing the Shah, then so installing the Shah, then the fall of the Shah, the Iranian Revolution, Iraq War Part 1, and I think, and obviously that disgusting, horrific war between Iraq and Iran, and it led us to 9/11. That's where we left it off, and we said, well, when we do the next episode, we'll start there and how 9/11 led to the two wars and where we are today. But before talking about 9/11, there's two things, Scott, we skipped. Many things we skipped that would, there's a lot to discuss, but two big topics I want you to cover, especially with what's happening right now with the first Iran war and likely or potentially a second one, is how did Israel get their nuclear warheads? I think it was back French support after the Suez Canal crisis. I'd love you to break that down for the audience, because a lot of people don't know how Israel got to become a nuclear armed state. And also, when did Iran's nuclear ambitions begin? So if you can cover those 2 points, break it down, and then we'll start at 9/11, if that's all right.
Okay, sure. So Israel, man, I'm not sure when exactly what year they got the atomic bomb. I know that they had stolen weapons fuel from the United States. They had a plant called Numek in Pennsylvania, which was essentially a front for the Israeli government, and they had enriched up to weapons grade there, and then they smuggled a lot of that uranium out of the country. And there was a smuggling ring that included Benjamin Netanyahu and Arnon Sofer. No, pardon me, not Arnon Sofer. That's somebody else. Arnon Milchan, the Israeli spy who produced the movie JFK and a bunch of other movies. But he was also a spy, and they stole the Krytrons, which were an essential part of the nuclear triggers for setting off an implosion system for a plutonium bomb. And then the Israelis made their own, what they claimed was a civilian nuclear reactor at Dimona, which had a secret weapons capability there. And they even took American inspectors on a Potemkin tour of the thing, where they disguised it all and hid the weapons potential in it. But I guess eventually the CIA figured it out, and President Kennedy had demanded inspections and really wanted them to stop. And but that all changed with Lyndon Johnson, who was very much in the pocket of the Israelis, and I believe even knew about the smuggling of the uranium out of the country. It's been too long since I read this book, but there's a great book called Divert, by Grant F. Smith, which is all about this the smuggling of nuclear materials and triggers and all of that out of the United States. Really good stuff. And then I'm not sure when they tested their first one. And then they proliferated them to South Africa even, although the South Africans gave up their nukes at the end of apartheid. They gave them up. So they're no longer a weapons state, but that was where they got them from, was the Israelis, who had a very close relationship with the apartheid government in South Africa. But they've had, and then so see, Mordechai Vanunu, I believe it was in 1986, was when the Israeli whistleblower Mordechai Vanunu revealed to the London Sunday Times that Israel had 200 atom bombs. And something else that Grant F. Smith uncovered was that they had at least been researching how to make hydrogen bombs. We don't know whether they ever achieved H-bomb capability or not. We know they were at least looking into it. But Mordechai Vanunu famously then was caught in a honey trap in Rome and locked in solitary confinement for like 20 or 25 years or something like this, horribly persecuted by his government for telling the truth about their program. And in fact,
where was he jailed? Who was that again?
his name is Mordechai Vanunu, and he was an Israeli nuclear scientist who took pictures of it all and revealed the whole program to the London Sunday Times. I'm almost certain it was in 1986, and you should still be able to find these articles online to this day about it.
And he was jailed for 20, 25 years under solitary confinement.
I believe so, yes.
Wow.
If you got a fact checker in the room, have him double check me on that, but I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I'll have KK in the background. We'll check that, but yeah.
Yeah, great. And I actually communicated with him on Twitter one time, and he verified to me that, yeah, the number in the London Times is right. I stand by that, 200. So he said that to me personally over old Twitter years ago. So that's where I got that from. And so then they've had this nuclear weapons monopoly in the Middle East ever since then. And they have this strange strategic ambiguity where they say things like, well, we will never introduce nuclear weapons into the region. As though like what you're doing is going, ladies and gentlemen, my atom bombs, and like, right, but they have introduced them into the region by having them in the region, and everybody knows they have them, but they have this like kind of silly denial, which leads to just backbreaking gymnastics on the part of American officials trying to pretend that they don't know whether Israel has nukes or not, or that they can't comment, and it's a big secret, when, of course, Colin Powell and many other American officials at certain times have admitted that, yes, of course they have nuclear weapons. Everybody knows that Israel is a nuclear weapon state, and yet they remain outside of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which, Mario, means that all American aid to Israel is illegal because they are a nuclear weapon state that is not a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So
no one talks about that.
There's no rule of law here,
By the way, your stats about Vanunu spending times 18 years in prison, 11 in solitary confinement. So accurate number. Dave. It's not accurate. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. So that's how Israel got their nuclear weapons. I think it started off with France supporting the initial development, and then expanded to. And I think France stopped in the 60s, and then they kind of took it on their own. And that's where the conspiracy of a lot of people like to say that Israel was behind Kennedy's assassination. And that's because of that theory that Kennedy was trying to inspect. Exactly. Was trying to inspect those facilities.
Look, I'm not a big JFK guy. And in fact, because when I was really getting interested in politics, I really was kind of a conspiracy guy. But I knew that there was a stack of books about JFK this high that I just wasn't willing to read them all. And I really don't care that much. And so I never picked this particular avenue of investigation. But I think the new documents that are coming out, if you read Jefferson Morley, he's a former Washington Post reporter and probably the most credible and interesting of the JFK investigators to me. I don't spend that much time reading, but it's looking more and more like the faction of CIA that may have been behind this were really being run by James Jesus Angleton, who was, if not an Israeli double agent, was at least the absolutely most pro-Israel force in all of the CIA. And so, you can add that to your pile of potential reasons for his murder, but it's not completely outside the realm of possibility, quite frankly, and particularly when you take into account what an absolute in-the-tank Zionist Lyndon Baines Johnson was. And in fact, even one of his mistresses was a Mossad agent. I'm sorry, I forget her name at the time, but you can check me on that. He had, one of his girlfriends at the time that he was president was Mossad. And so, and plus he'd just been, I believe he was raised very Zionist. He knew Zionist Jews, and he knew born again end times Christians growing up who all, were very much in support of the Zionist project like his whole life. So I'm not saying he was just bribed and corrupt, but he was that too.
And let's go into Iran. When did Iran start having nuclear ambitions?
They, under the Shah in the 1970s, they began building a civilian nuclear program. And in fact, somewhere you can find, I think I have this in my file somewhere, is a copied page out of a Time magazine or Newsweek where it was an advertisement by, I think it was General Electric. It could have been like Honeywell, maybe. That was like announcing our new nuclear reactor project in Iran. And it was like a big, it was like an advertisement for their thing, basically selling the stock, I guess, in the company, that like, these are the major moves we're making in the world, spreading atoms for peace. That was what Eisenhower called it. And so as long as the Iranian regime was a loyal client, I don't think they really wanted the Shah getting nuclear weapons. They didn't mind him having, a rudimentary nuclear program. But I don't think they ever got very far with that. And then after the revolution, 1979, I think would have been completely mothballed. Whatever they did have would have been essentially no progress whatsoever through the era of the of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. And they may have, begun doing some research into uranium enrichment in the 1990s. I think. Geez, I'm sorry. I would have to go back and see when their Bushehr and Iraq reactors were constructed originally. I think they may both have gone back to the Shah's era and then were only turned on and run. See, they um I'm sorry, I forget. That might not be right. The Bushehr reactor may have been built in the W. Bush years. I know that their enrichment capability came from black market stuff that they bought from A.Q. Khan, who was the Pakistani nuclear
Oh,
equipment.
yes.
So he had stolen all of these blueprints, like a ton of blueprints and technology and whatever uh, information from
Mm.
I think it was a joint French and Belgian firm called Urenco, and he stole all that stuff, and the CIA knew he stole it and let him get away because they wanted to see where he went. The damn
Oh,
fools! And
really?
so
So the Pakistani, the Mr. Khan, the CIA let him get away? They were
they let him
monitoring him
get
the whole
away.
time?
Yeah, they knew he had stolen all the stuff, and they let him do it. I forget my source for that. It's been 20 years since I read about that, but you can find that somewhere, I'm sure. Um, but then so this was the basis of the Pakistani nuclear weapons program, was
Mhm.
based on the centrifuges that he, had designed and all that, and then he proliferated this stuff. He sold aluminum tubes, the legit kind, for centrifuges, to North Korea, as well as to Iran. But now I'm blanking, and I've plead guilty here. I'm sorry that I don't remember exactly what all they got from him. I know they got centrifuges from him to build their
Mm.
original cascades at Natanz. I'm not sure if any of the Bushehr and Iraq reactors came from him, but I think they very well may have, because um, in the 1990s, Iran was trying to buy light water reactors, and they were gonna get a light water reactor, at least one, from China, and Bill Clinton intervened and essentially prevented the Chinese, one way or the other, I forget, just, I guess, leaned on them and made them, break the deal and not deliver a light water reactor. And the thing is, if you wanted to really call Iran's bluff and say, "So you guys want a civilian nuclear program, huh? Well, giving them light water reactors makes a lot of sense, because a light water reactor produces waste that is so polluted with all different isotopes and things that you can essentially not refine weapons grade plutonium out of the waste the way that you can a heavy water reactor. That's the point of a light water reactor, is that it doesn't produce weapons fuel as waste. And so by sabotaging that deal, the Iranians ended up, I think, yeah, then in late Clinton and early Bush years would have been then when they ended up building the heavy water facility at Bushehr. And then later they dug this giant underground warehouse at Natanz in 2005. And I believe it was in the beginning of 2006 that they started introducing the uranium centrifuges at Natanz and began enriching uranium, all of which, was declared. They claim that Iran was breaking the law and in violation of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and in violation of their safeguards agreement with the IAEA to do these things, but that's not true. The stipulation under the International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards agreement is that they have to announce 6 months before they introduce nuclear material into any machine in order to change it in any way. And so they were totally within that realm. So had they dug the facility in secret? Yes. But had they introduced nuclear material into any machines before being called out? No. And in fact, they claim that it was the Israelis who called them out, but I believe it was actually, and maybe he was tipped off by the Israelis, but it was the American nuclear analyst David Albright who first identified the site at Natanz, and there wasn't a single spinning centrifuge in there at the time. And years later, the same kind of scam happened when they built the Fordo facility, otherwise known as COM, and which is under the mountain there. It was one of the targets in the War of June, where they built the secondary centrifuge facility. And the war party in America and Europe just claimed that they had outed the Iranians for having this secret facility. But it was just a lie. And you just check the timeline. The Iranians announced to the IAEA, we have a facility we want to show you because in approximately 6 months, we're going to be introducing nuclear material there. So just like in the deal, we are declaring this facility to you. And then the next day, the Americans went, aha, we caught you. You have a facility and we are announcing it to the world. When, what are you talking about? They already said the same thing themselves the day before. And then they just lied and pretended, and the whole world went along. The Times and the Post and the Journal and all the TV went along with pretending that they had outed this secret facility, which the Iranians had admitted to themselves. And so what's the bottom line here? The bottom line is that the Ayatollah, up until June anyway, ask me again about post-June in a second. Up until June of 25, the Ayatollah's position had been that they were developing a nuclear capability under the guise of a civilian nuclear program, which it is. It provides electricity. They only need 3.6% enriched uranium-235 for that. They can go up to 20% for targets for their medical isotope reactors. And the point of this being, look, and I'm not asking anyone to be naive about this. The Iranians' cover story is that this is all about electricity, man. It's fine. I'm not asking you to believe that. I don't think that that's really right. I think it's maybe 60-40 about electricity, but what's the 40? The 40 is proving that they know how to enrich uranium. They have mastered the fuel cycle. They can turn uranium metal into uranium hexafluoride gas. They can enrich it up to higher and higher percentages of uranium-235, the sweet stuff, and they can convert it back into metal again, which means they have the potential to make nuclear warheads. In other words, don't mess with me, or I might begin to make nuclear bombs. So it is a latent nuclear deterrent. It's what they call a nuclear threshold state, equivalent to Germany, Japan, or Brazil. We know that they can make nuclear weapons, but they're not making them. Apparently, they don't feel the need to make them. And so let's not put them in a position where they decide that they feel like now they do need to make them. So this has been the standoff this whole time, see, is the Americans saying, if you make a nuke, we'll attack you. And the Iranians saying, hey, if you don't attack us, we won't make a nuke. But if you do attack us, we might. Right? Which was the perfect standoff and the perfect basis for a negotiation, which more or less was the agreement that Barack Obama reached in 2015. And don't misunderstand me as giving credit to the guys. The only thing he ever did right was try to take war off the table by increasing the amount of inspections and scaling back the Iranians' nuclear program. It's true, the deal was not perfect. There were sunset provisions in it and things that still could have required further negotiation. But he was trying to prevent war by demonstrating to everyone that we know what they do not have. And we know what they are and are not doing. It's not, we're not wondering. We've rolled back their program enough and expanded inspections enough that we can guarantee the civilian nature of their program. And we can guarantee that if they try to break out and make a nuke, it will take them so long that we will be able to bomb them first. And we'll be able to essentially blow up any progress that they have made before they're able to complete the first one. So now, Mario, put yourself in the position of the Ayatollah. He can't really break out and make a nuke because we'll bomb him if he does. So he's sort of got this latent deterrent. Then the Israelis and the Americans call his bluff in June and bomb him. But then you gotta, I'm an anti-war guy, and I've warned for a couple of decades now that if we do this, that is what is most likely to drive Iran to now want to get a nuke and to get a nuke. And I still think that that's true. And because why? They attacked them. They were not able to destroy every last thing in there by air. And Iran could just build a deeper tunnel under a taller mountain and continue where they left off from. It would take them a while, but we don't have the ability to truly stop them from spinning centrifuges without a full-scale regime change and occupation of the country, which is not in the cards. It cannot happen. So essentially, the war in June they claimed was a great success, but it was only the first quarter. We don't know, one, whether they're going to continue to enrich uranium, whether they have the ability to restart soon. I do think that it's almost certain that they are going to continue enriching uranium, at least at their first opportunity, that they have not been stopped from that. And then whether America is going to accept that, or whether we're going to go back to war. And we're essentially, again, the only actual end state where you can guarantee that they are definitely not going to make a nuke is if you can put a new sock puppet dictator in there and control him to that degree. And that's just
But do you think that's the plan? But do you think that's the plan for the next war? And I was interviewing, I can't remember his name yesterday, and he made the assumption that he expects the war before the midterm, so by December this year, and before Iran is able to rebuild a lot of their capabilities. So that was his timeline. There was an interview with Mr. Trita.
no
Just so
tree
you know.
parsley.
Yeah,
So-
Parsi, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, your thoughts on that? And then if what he's saying is right, if the only way to completely remove their ability to build a nuclear weapon is through a regime change, does that mean this is Israel and potentially America's strategy in the next war?
Yeah. Okay. So a couple of things there. First of all, I agree with Trita that they are more likely to make a nuke now than they ever were before. Their government announced at the United Nations, I believe yesterday, or might have been the day before yesterday, that I'm sorry, I only just saw the headline. I didn't see if it was the foreign minister or what, but that they announced that they are still not making nuclear weapons, that they have no interest in making nuclear weapons, that the previous Ayatollah and the current Ayatollah's fatwa against weapons of mass destruction still stand, and that you had no reason to attack us because we weren't making a nuke anyway, and we're still not. So bluff called, and we're still not making a nuke because we told you we weren't. Now, I'm not saying that we can believe that. That's exactly what they would say if they have decided to break out toward a nuclear weapon. And now we have a break in the chain of custody and continuity of the inspections. So is it possible that now, in the aftermath of the war, they've been able to divert enough uranium from their program that now they can invite the inspectors in, try to make it look like everything is still copacetic when in fact something has been diverted? There's a real risk there. And I'm not trying to hawk it up against them and accuse them of making nuclear weapons, because it is a plausible denial. It's been true that they weren't making nuclear weapons up until now. And so it's maybe 51% or even higher percent likely that it's true that they're still not. But they're certainly much more likely now to pursue nuclear weapons. The real problem, though, is that regardless, let's say they don't, that the guy yesterday was, or a couple days ago was telling the truth.
Scott, why do you think they reached their uranium at such a high level post October 7th?
Oh, well, it wasn't post October 7th. It was post Israeli sabotage at Natanz. First, they killed the head of the Iranian nuclear program in December of 2020. And then they did a big sabotage at Natanz in April of 2021. And it was in the aftermath of that they started enriching up to 60%. It was not correlated with the October 7th attack at all. And the only purpose of that was so that they could negotiate it away. That was exactly what it was. Because 60% is useless to you. You need 20% for your medical isotope reactors. You need at least 85, but usually they say 90 or better percent U-235 to make a nuclear warhead out of it. So what is the point of 60%? It's just a bigger bluff. As they say, if you read about it in the journal, they'll say, well, it's easier to go from 60 to 90 than from 20 to 90. Well, yeah, that's right. So in other words, it's a card to play in
Better
negotiation.
deterrence. I assumed it was, especially after the proxies were all hit by Israel, then that deterrence became a lot more important when Hezbollah was decapitated, when the Houthis were decapitated, when Hamas is almost
That came later.
non-existent.
I mean, that
Yeah, exactly. But I made
Yeah.
the assumption that then the deterrence became a lot more important. But you said it, that enrichment, the increase in enrichment started in 2020 after the sabotage.
Yeah, and it was,
Mm.
Trump tore up the treaty in
JCPOA.
2018. Yeah, and then the Israelis went right back to their assassination campaign and all of that, and then they killed the head of the nuclear program, Fakhrizadeh, in December of 20. So and then remember at the dawn of the war, we were in negotiations. Donald Trump and his team were sending out signals that the negotiations are getting there. And the big pill to swallow for the Western side is that we will accept some enrichment because the Ayatollah will die before he gives up enrichment. That's a fact. They are not, that's like to them, obviously, the like most important symbol of their independence and sovereignty is that they insist on their right to enrich. And people go, as I said before, the civilian nuclear program in a way can be seen as a fig leaf for the nuclear deterrent. But then again, now that their bluff is called, it's not in evidence that they're pursuing nuclear weapons. And by the way, it does make economic sense for Iran that does have a domestic supply of uranium, as well as obviously huge domestic supplies of oil, to burn the uranium and sell the oil. There's not nearly as much of a demand on the world market for uranium as there is for petroleum. So it only makes sense to run their domestic electricity program off of uranium if they got some, and so they can sell the oil and spend that on everything else. So just in terms of comparative advantage, it makes sense for them to do that. And if we normalized relations with Iran and put all of this competition, and especially strategic competition in the region aside, then it wouldn't matter anyway, right? We don't care that Pakistan has nuclear weapons. We're friends with Pakistan. And so it's the same kind of thing. You win more flies with honey and that kind of deal. It's sort of like they say, well, we had to nuke Hiroshima and Nagasaki because how else could we get them to unconditionally surrender? Yeah, well, maybe you could have dropped the unconditional surrender thing, so you didn't have to go that far. It's the same thing here. We just kind of bake in the premise that since Iran is our satanic, eternal, evil enemy that must be kept at bay with fire at all times, we're supposed to assume that at the start of any discussion here. When the reality is Donald Trump could just get on a plane and fly to Tehran and make friends with the Ayatollah, tell Netanyahu to go to hell, and we could just have the first day of the rest of our lives starts tomorrow. There's no reason it has to be like this at all.
Could we see that happen? Not flying into Tehran, but could we see normalization of relations between the US and Iran? Not now, obviously, it seems impossible now, but over the next 5 years, because we see Saudi and Iran get closer together. Obviously, China negotiated the normalization there, but now after the Qatar strike, I think the Arab countries are all coming, or the Middle Eastern countries are coming together more than before. And then you've got this sentiment. There's a whole new generation, and a treaty also talked about it yesterday. Is that there's a whole new generation that is shifting their stance on Israel. So then normalization of relations with Iran just does not seem that taboo anymore. Could we see that happen maybe by the next administration? Is it more of a possibility today than it was, 10, 20, 30 years ago?
I mean, the only rub here is the damn Likud. We could have solved this problem, this whole time. It was Dick Cheney in the 1990s wanted to normalize relations with Iran before he was Bush's vice president. It was Zbigniew Brzezinski who was on the job during the Iranian Revolution and had all that egg on his face for the hostage crisis, the revolution, the failed rescue mission, everything made Zbigniew Brzezinski look absolutely like trash. But by 1993, he said we should normalize relations with Iran. Just like Cheney said, we should build an oil pipeline across Iran, get that Caspian oil, and then find a way to include Iran in the business as a way to normalize with them. The revolution was a long time ago. They always bring up the Beirut bombing of our Marines in 1983, when it wasn't even Iran that did that. It was an Iranian-backed group that did that. And Ronald Reagan sold Iran missiles through Israel within 1 year of that. Okay? So if Ronald Reagan can deal with the mean old Ayatollah right after Beirut, then there ain't no reason in the world why we should even have to suffer listening to the words Beirut 1983 out of the mouths of the war party in the year 2025. You know, as it's in George Washington's farewell address. He says we should have no permanent alliances, but he said we should have no permanent enemies either. It's just crazy that we're doing this. And you know, it wasn't just Brzezinski and Kissinger, but also Alexander Haig, who was Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State and a Henry Kissinger acolyte. You know, Kissinger was a Rockefeller man, and they lost a lot in the revolution. And here, even a Rockefeller man like Haig is willing to, or at least Kissinger's man is willing to say we should be doing business with the Ayatollah. And that was back at the start of the Clinton years. And then what ruined it? Israel ruined it. They vetoed it. The Rabin regime wasn't even the Likud then. It was Labor that did, because they wanted to get along with the Arabs and negotiate with the Palestinians. And so they had to demonize somebody. So they turned on their friends, the Persian Iranians, and started to demonize them and screwed the whole policy up. And they insisted, even though Bill Clinton, again, I'm sorry if I sound like I'm ever saying anything where I'm giving credit to a Democrat. I don't mean to, but it's just the factual history is that Bill Clinton was at least considering normalizing relations with Iraq and Iran when he was inaugurated in 1993. And it was the Israelis.
What a difference that would have made. What a difference that would have made to the Middle East.
You see, what happened was the Bush administration, the Bush senior administration had already made the massive strategic error in keeping our troops in Saudi Arabia after Iraq War I. They wanted to bomb Iraq. They could have just bombed them from aircraft carriers in the Gulf. They didn't need to have these permanent bases on the Holy Land, which is a major problem and driving factor in Al-Qaeda terrorism against the United States. But then Clinton kept this policy. And why? It was because Martin Indyk, who people say he was a liberal or a leftist or a labor guy, whatever, he had worked directly for Yitzhak Shamir. I saw someone in a comment section somewhere say, I didn't know what I was talking about, that he wasn't a right winger. Well, he literally cashed paychecks from the government of Yitzhak Shamir to advise them on their public relations. That's who he was. And Yitzhak Shamir was a murderer and a terrorist and a right-wing lunatic that makes Benjamin Netanyahu look like a decent gentleman. And that's who he was. And so Yitzhak Shamir's agent, Martin Indyk, comes to town and goes to work for Bill Clinton as a special envoy to Israel-Palestine. And the first thing that he does is he essentially pressures Bill Clinton into adopting the new prime minister of Israel, Yitzhak Rabin's policy that they called dual containment, which meant America had to stay in Saudi Arabia in order to bomb and blockade Iraq and still force the sanctions regime in the Cold War against Iran, because America beat up Iraq so bad in Iraq War I that Iraq was no longer strong enough to balance against Iran. So now America had to stay to balance against them both. You mentioned the Great Treaty of Parsi. This is all in his book, Treacherous Alliance, which is the best book you will ever read about the Middle East and the background of all of this stuff. It's fantastic. And so it was Israel's man. And it was only after, and I don't think the Israelis were in on this, it was the Kuwaitis who made up the ridiculous lie that Saddam Hussein tried to kill George Bush Sr. with a truck bomb in 1993, which everyone still believes to this day, which was a ridiculous hoax. It was just a whiskey smuggling ring that they blew up into this plot. And guess what? The same guy who made up that lie was the same guy whose daughter 2 years before had claimed, or 3 years before had claimed about the soldiers throwing the Kuwaiti babies out of their incubators and stealing their incubators in order to launch Iraq War I. So in other words, that man who sent his daughter to tell that lie, that same man told the lie about the plot against Bush Sr. And it was on that occasion that Bill Clinton launched a bunch of cruise missiles at Baghdad, killing a famous artist, Laila al-Attar, and inaugurated the dual containment policy, which meant America had to stay in Saudi to bomb and blockade and contain Iraq and Iran, which is, again, the major cause of Al-Qaeda's war against the United States.
Now we get into 9/11, how it all links together. And I know Tucker Carlson's releasing you did a long interview with him. I remember listening to it a while ago about this. And he's released now a documentary not sure if you're on it. I'm sure you would be. About 9/11. Have you seen the first episode? Or have you seen it at all?
I've seen it all. Yeah, if you're a member of
Oh,
his
nice.
website, you can see all 5 parts or 6 parts of it or whatever. So yeah, it's
I haven't had time to watch it. I was going to, and then I think the Charlie Kirk assassination happened just before he released it, a couple of days beforehand,
right. Yeah,
and
he
that kind of
delayed.
took all the attention away. Yeah, so perfect time to pivot. So the main reason and why we're doing that pivot now is that the main reasons that Osama bin Laden gave for 9/11 were, one, the US bases in Saudi, the Holy Land, and number two is American support for Israel. So let's tell us the story. How did Al-Qaeda? So we talked in part one how Al-Qaeda, was allied to an extent with the US against the Soviets, and later turned on the US. And somehow, despite all the attacks on America kept supporting it as if it's like the West is like a cost for being the hegemonist empire of the world. Like, hey, terrorism is just a cost for us to have that total control, but that backfired. I'd love you to tell the audience the story.
Yeah. So, and look, for the people who are already like built-in 9/11 truthers on this subject, at least bear with me for a minute, and I'll maybe try to address at least some of that stuff at the end of this. But there is a lot to it. And it does, as you say, go back to America's support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s. And that wasn't just the local Afghan Mujahideen. That was what they called the Arab Afghan Army, or the International Islamic Brigades. And it was mostly Arabs from the Middle East, but it also included Chechens, Filipinos, Americans, Indonesians, and people who came from all over the place to go and help fight the Holy Jihad against the godless commie USSR, which importantly was successful. Not only did they drive the Russian army out, the Soviet army out in frustration, but the same year they saw the wall come down, and within 2 years, they saw the entire dissolution of the Soviet Union. And at the end of 1991, every last Soviet stand being set free and the entire USSR coming apart. Not that Afghanistan was ever one of the Soviet stands. It was just a sock puppet regime. The rest of them were, though, and they were all set free. And so from the point of view of the Mujahideen and the point of view of the Americans and their allies, it worked. This was great. And of course, to the Reaganites, they did it. To the Mujahideen, they did it, right? And then at the end of the war, they needed something to do. One of the first things they did was go and fight a minor civil war in Tajikistan, which I'm pretty sure they lost, and which I did not research that for my books. I really wish I have. I was on such a time crunch, and it seemed like it was kind of a sideshow. It was over very quickly, but then they went on to Bosnia, and they started, look, they only hanged and killed the last commie dictator of Afghanistan, Najibullah, in 1991, the end of 1991. They started rolling right into Bosnia in 1992 to fight the jihad there against the Serbs and to begin breaking that country up, which America, for various reasons, got involved in, mostly just because they were trying to prevent Germany from taking a more active role in the situation by going ahead and intervening themselves in a ham-handed way to make sure to maintain American dominance inside NATO and in Europe in the post-Cold War era. While America was distracted with Iraq War I, Germany was kind of getting out ahead of us in Bosnia or in the former Yugoslavia, at least. So the Americans wanted to put an end to that by finding their way into Yugoslavia, where they immediately recognized the secession of Bosnia from Yugoslavia, which was then dominated by a Muslim government that refused to share power as they were supposed to under the Constitution, and quickly started a civil war because there were so many Croatian and Serbian Bosnians who didn't want to go with the new Muslim-dominated country and wanted instead to remain either with Croatia or with Serbia. So that caused a major conflict, and the Bin Ladenites came with American and Allied help, especially the British and the Saudis, came to help and fight that war through 1995, when then they were kicked out of there. But then very quickly they moved on to Kosovo, at the southern end of former Yugoslavia, and joined up with what was called the Kosovo Liberation Army, and which was, chock full of Bin Ladenites. And that's who these guys were the Mujahideen from the last war. And then they did the same thing in Chechnya. Now I have a little bit about this in my
but just Scott, just for the audience, like America was supporting these guys, the Mujahideen, in those wars. They're supporting them in Bosnia, which is an ongoing war, the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. They supported them in Kosovo, the KLA, for Kosovo's independence. You know, I interviewed the president of Kosovo. I'm trying to interview the president of Srpska to kind of go through that history as well, because that's ongoing. People don't know that the Bosnia now is looking at potentially breaking up between, I think, Bosnia and Srpska, I think it is. And then Chechnya, which is the fight where Putin bombed the hell out of them. And the US was
so here's the deal. The way I'm not very good at telling this story. I'm sure there's like a great marble cake kind of way that a smarter guy could tell this story. But I basically tell the story through, I go, look, here's what the Mujahideen was doing and over there and America's support for them. Then here's what the Mujahideen was doing attacking us. Then here is their motive and here's their strategy. Maybe I don't tell that all in the right order. Maybe I'll do it like this. So first of all, here is Bill Clinton's government is still supporting these guys in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Chechnya throughout the 90s, when they're already turning on the United States and attacking us. So, and I think it does make the most sense to put it this way. We'll just go through the attacks real quick, okay? The first, what we call Al-Qaeda, was essentially the combination of what had been the Azam group in Afghanistan and Egyptian Islamic Jihad. And they essentially merged together. So when we talk about Egyptian Islamic Jihad attacks in the United States, that's essentially proto-Al-Qaeda, and they were already more or less merged together. Like we have Bin Laden himself donated to the legal defense fund of the guys who did the first World Trade Center bombing and stuff like that, right? So this is all tied very together. Bin Laden financed also, or I believe, I forget exactly the connection, but there was a direct connection between him and, I think, again, maybe for helping fund the defense of people accused of doing the hotel bombing in Aden in 1992. He was directly connected to that. I forget exactly why, but Peter Bergen talks about that in one of his books, about that first that first hotel bombing in Aden, Yemen in 92, and how that was directly connected to Bin Laden. So this is already what we call Al-Qaeda, was like proto-Al-Qaeda doing this stuff. So first, they killed Rabbi Kahane in New York in 1990. In 92, they bombed this hotel in Aden, Yemen. In 93, they blew up the World Trade Center. Now, the FBI could have stopped that because they had a walk-in informant who was going to make a fake bomb, but they screwed him over. So the real terrorist was brought in, Ramzi Youssef, and he built the real bomb that almost succeeded in toppling one tower over into the other. It's a hell of a scandal, its own separate giant thing. Then in 1995, you had the attack that killed Americans training the Saudi National Guard in Saudi Arabia. And you also had the Bojinka plot, which didn't actually happen, but is very well worth noting because this is Ramzi Youssef, the guy that cooked the bomb for the first World Trade Center plan. He escaped to the Philippines. And then there was a fire at his apartment, and he escaped again to Pakistan. He was later arrested in Pakistan. He's in the Supermax in Florence right now, but he escaped twice. But when he escaped from the Philippines, he left two buddies behind, Abdul Hakim Murad and Wali Khan Amin Shah. And these guys got busted, and they had his laptop. And on his laptop, Ramzi Youssef's laptop, there was a plan to kill the Pope, to kill President Clinton, that would have been John Paul II, to kill President Clinton on their trips to the Philippines, a plan to time bomb 12 planes over the Pacific, and a plan to crash 10 planes into landmarks in the United States. And that's the origin of the September 11th plan. It was supposedly Abdul Hakim Murad was the one who had come up with the idea that we could do like kamikaze type attacks. That was one of the things that was found on that laptop. This was what's known as Bojinka, although the origin of that term is highly in dispute. It was said to be a Serbo-Croatian term.
What year was that?
This is in 1995. And so
that was before the war in Chechnya. So American support was ongoing during that period.
Well,
in Yugoslavia and later on in Chechnya.
Yeah, let me say carefully about Chechnya here that, and I barely touch on this enough enough already. I do a much more thorough job covering this in Provoked, my more recent book about the Cold War here. I don't have any indication that America backed the Mujahideen in the first Chechen war. Now, Clinton's government actually financed Russia's side of the first and second Chechen wars, which were 94 through 96 and 99 through like 05. But, Clinton began, but he was also, his CIA was backing the Chechen side too in the second war. And W. Bush picked up that same policy. But that would be in the second war in 1999 through, 04, 05-ish. In the first Chechen war, I don't have any indication that I've ever seen that America was involved on the terrorist side at that time. I wouldn't put
But
it
they were
past
in
them.
Yugoslavia.
They definitely were in Yugoslavia right during that time, in 94 and 95 especially. And they even had the Iranians backing Al-Qaeda. And this is funny. As long as we're bringing this up, I'm off on a tangent. There was a mini scandal in that Bill Clinton cut out the CIA and made a separate deal with the Iranians to arm the Bosnian Muslims, which is funny because the Iranians are the Shiites, of course, and the Bosnian Muslims are not. And the Republicans complained at the time, why would you turn to those dastardly Iranians to arm the Bosnian Mujahideen? Don't you know we've got this great network through Saudi Arabia and all these great veterans of the war in Afghanistan? Why don't we just use those networks? Which, of course, we're doing that too. But they also let the Ayatollah do this. And I regret I got in an argument with this right-wing kook on, a war party guy. No offense against good right-wingers, but a war party guy on the Piers Morgan show. And he was just screaming at me that you deny that Iran ever backed Al-Qaeda. And I screwed up because I said, no, of course not. You got it all wrong. You don't even know who's on whose side here. And I wish I had said, well, okay, one time, but just as a favor to Bill Clinton in Bosnia in 1994 and 1995.
That was your debate. That was your recent debate with Pierce, the latest one.
No, that would have been a couple
That was
ago.
the old one. Okay.
Yeah, Ben Ferguson.
Okay, so
anyway, point being that go ahead.
No, I was saying we're back to America supporting the what became Al-Qaeda.
Oh yeah, so no. I'm on my list of attacks now. We got hung up on Bojinka in 95. Let me keep going. In 1996, they blew up the Khobar Towers in Saudi Arabia, which they blamed on Iran. And to this day, they blame on Iran and Iranian-backed Shiite Saudi Hezbollah, which is an absolute ridiculous joke and a lie. And the former head of the CIA's Bin Laden unit, Michael Scheuer, told me himself that was Bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
Didn't Bin Laden take credit for that?
Yes, he absolutely did. To Abdel Bari Atwan, the editor of Al-Quds Al-Arabi. And it's in his book, The Secret History of Al-Qaeda, and he wrote about it in an article in The Guardian. You can find it right now, where Bin Laden not only did he take credit for it, but he named the martyrs by name and said how they're surely in heaven now and blah, 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 with all of his crap, justifying the thing. But what the Saudi kingdom wanted to deflect and blame it on Iran. And they went for that. In fact, there's a PBS documentary about John O'Neill, who was the head of FBI counterterrorism in New York. And now he was working, before 9/11, this was a job for the FBI and the CIA kind of shared responsibility. It wasn't a war on terrorism. It was, they would indict these guys and prosecute them in New York as best they could and that kind of thing. So John O'Neill from the FBI was working these cases overseas. And he went to go and work the Khobar Towers case. And he told Louis Freeh, the head of the FBI, come on, Louis, or at least maybe call him Mr. Freeh, but come on, boss, the Saudis, they're just blowing smoke up your ass about all this Iran stuff. And then the claim was in the documentary that Louis Freeh was so uptight being a member of Opus Dei and this like extreme, very conservative Catholic that he got so offended over John O'Neill's belligerent use of the A word that he refused to listen to John O'Neill about terrorism or Al-Qaeda anymore because O'Neill was so uncouth as to use a bad word for a donkey to say that, you shouldn't be believing these Saudis and what they're telling you here. And still to this day, they blame that one on Iran. Now, why would Iran blow up the Khobar Towers? Mario, who was sleeping in the Khobar Towers? American airmen whose job it was to bomb Iraq from bases in Saudi Arabia. Now, why in the hell would Iran want to blow them up? Or Iran's sock puppets in Saudi Arabia, the despised Shiite minority oppressed by their ruthless Saudi Sunni monarchical tyranny. Why in the world would they do that? No reason whatsoever, because it's a damn lie. And then real quick, they blew up the embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania in August of 98. and they hit the USS Cole in the year 2000. Oh, and they tried to sneak a guy across the border at the end of 99 from British Columbia into Washington State, but he got caught. He had a plan to blow up either LAX or at least maybe try to get on a plane and blow up a plane.
So
At,
despite all these attacks failed and successful, they were still seen as an ally.
That's right. And America's still backing them as long as they're killing Serbs, as long as they're killing Russians, and then later, as we know, as long as they're killing Shiites and their Alawite allies, etc., then that's just effing fine. And now, and here's the motive, okay? The motive and the strategy. The motive, as we've already discussed, but this is absolutely clear from all of the writings that were produced during that time, and most especially the declaration of war against the Americans occupying the land of the two holy places, which bin Laden published in 1996. And then the follow-up, which was the Declaration of Jihad against Jews and Crusaders. And that was published in 1998. And in both cases, and plus in all of the propaganda from Al-Qaeda leadership during that time, their recruitment shtick, what they told people to recruit people to join their cause, was we are fighting the Americans because the Americans are already at war with us. And they're at war with us to wit. They occupy the holy Arabian Peninsula, not just home territory. And I can tell you as a Texan, any foreign occupying army try to put their boots on Texan soil, we'll just kill them until they're dead. That'll never last. Now imagine Jesus was born in San Antonio, okay? How desperately the American Anglo-Protestant Christians would fight for that town. Are you kidding me? Right? That's the position that they're looking from, okay? So that's
As in only Al-Qaeda, they're already at war with Islam. That's how Al-Qaeda framed it.
yeah, and with them particularly, right? And with them as the vanguard of the resistance against us. And so, one, we're occupying Saudi Arabia, the Holy Arabian Peninsula, birthplace of Muhammad and birthplace of the religion of Islam, in order to bomb and blockade Iraq. 2, 3, supporting Israel and their vicious crimes against the helpless civilian Palestinian population and against the Lebanese in their wars in southern Lebanon as well. And then American support for the dictators in the region, pressure, especially King Fahd in Saudi Arabia and Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, pressure on all of the regional kings, emirs, sultans, etc., to keep oil prices artificially low by overproducing according to market rates in order to essentially subsidize America's economy at their expense. And then, as they would always put it, although this is far from true, turning a blind eye to India, China, Russia, and Kazakhstan's violence against Muslims. They would say, see, they claim they love Muslims so much, but they don't care when it's the Russians, the Chinese, the Kazakhs, or the Indians killing us. Well, there's some truth to that, but not really. Here we are, America's backing the Mujahideen against the Russians in Chechnya, just like we had backed them in Afghanistan. And I usually leave this out. I don't know, just it's a weird category error in my mind's eye, I guess. But this is a part of the story too, is that America was backing the Taliban through Pakistan, backing the Taliban, first their rise to power in Afghanistan in 1996 in the first place, but also backing their training of Chinese Uyghurs from the far west of China. What used to be known as East Turkestan is now the Xinjiang province, and backing Chinese Uyghurs and training them for terrorist attacks against the Chinese. And this is all essentially part of the same continuing the Cold War policy of it worked so well in Afghanistan in the 1980s, we never stopped. So now, so that's their motives, okay? Occupying Saudi to bomb Iraq, backing Israel and their violence, support for the dictators, pressure on them to keep oil prices low, and turning a blind eye, the hypocrisy of turning a blind eye to other persecutions of Muslims throughout the world. Then the strategy, Mario, was to give America our own Afghanistan, just as it had been in Afghanistan, America's policy to give the Soviets their own Vietnam. Well, again, it worked. And from the point of view of the Mujahideen, that was what they were trying to replicate. And I wrote a book about this. You see it behind me, Fool's Errand and Time to End the War in Afghanistan. And I talk about a lot of the same material in enough already. But if you want a shorter version, I have an article in my archives at antiwar.com called Peter Bergen is about Osama bin Laden's strategy. And I'm trying to be polite because I know Peter Bergen was there when Peter Arnett interviewed Osama bin Laden in 1996 and fancies himself a bit of an expert. And he does know a lot about it, and including a lot of things that I don't know about it. No question about that. At the same time, though, he seems to completely reject the idea that bin Laden knew what he was doing, right? That this was anything other than like lashing out in some ignorant and idiot way, when in fact, they did not think that America was going to run home crying if they knocked our towers down. They could have potentially killed 10,000 people or more if those towers had come straight down. And remember in 1993, again, they were trying to knock one tower over into the other. Here's another one I always leave off of the list because it's just a category error in my mind I need to get straight and include. And speaking of Abdel-Bari Atwan, the editor of Al-Quds Al-Arabi in London, bin Laden told him it was his men who were responsible for Black Hawk Down in Somalia in 1993. They had embedded themselves with the warlord Adid's men, and they were the ones who had shot down the helicopter and helped kill those Rangers and Delta guys in Mogadishu in 93. And bin Laden complained to Abdel-Bari Atwan, I was so disappointed when the Americans left. We wanted to fight a war of attrition against them there. Force them out the hard way. See, so the point is, you might argue, okay, plan A is set off a truck bomb and hope that America just turns tail and run. And this was what Peter Bergen actually would point out. In Somalia, Bill Clinton did turn tail and run, and that bin Laden was inspired by that and saw Reagan fled Beirut. Hang on one second. So Reagan fled Beirut after one big truck bomb. Clinton fled Mogadishu after one big helicopter shoot down. So, okay, America's just a paper tiger. So you could argue, as Bergen argues, and I would accept that at least that's plan A, that they thought if they could just keep blowing up our guys enough that we would say, forget this, it's not worth the cost. But they weren't naive, Mario. They didn't think that was what was going to happen. And I've spoken about this at length with Michael Scheuer, the former chief of the CIA's bin Laden unit, numerous times, that the plan was to force an overreaction. If blowing up our embassies in Africa is not enough to make us turn around and come home, then knocking our towers down in Manhattan will hopefully be enough to convince us to invade Afghanistan, where then they can break our empire on those mountains the same way that we had helped them do to the Soviets. And man, it only makes sense. There were only 400 Al-Qaeda guys in the world in the fall of 2001 hiding out there with bin Laden in the Nangarhar province. How's a group of bandits, a group of outlaws hiding out in the wilderness supposed to take on a superpower? And the answer is you infiltrate a special forces squad in there to do a big ass atrocity in order to convince that superpower to blow its own brains out, to convince that superpower to invade. As bin Laden's son, Omar, said, when Bush was elected, my father was so happy. He said, this is the kind of president he needs, one who will invade and spend money and break the country.
Osama said that to his son.
That's right. And his son told that to Rolling Stone magazine in 2010. You can read it. It's an interview with Omar bin Laden. He says, in Clinton's time, America was smart, not like the bull that runs after the red scarf. And then what happened? We invaded Afghanistan. We spent $10 trillion and lost anyway. And our empire has suffered greatly since, of course.
So essentially you're saying that the Mujahideen, and later Al-Qaeda managed to bring down the two biggest militaries, the two biggest superpowers, initially the Soviet Union back in the 90s, and later on the US after 2001. I want to go back to one comment you made.
We haven't,
not gone yet, but not yet, but it's very stretched, stretched very thin. We are living in a multipolar world. So to an extent, you could say that, Russia's not gone completely either. It's one of those superpowers.
Let me add one more statement on that. Just one short sentence too. Michael Scheuer, the former chief of the CIA's bin Laden unit, said that Afghanistan was what they wanted. Iraq was the hoped for but unexpected gift to bin Laden. If all they ever wanted to do was trick us into invading Afghanistan and killing ourselves there, well, what do you think about turning Ba'athist secular Iraq upside down 1,000 miles to the west? Right? I mean, and they made tens of thousands more mujahideen with that war. Never even mind then Barack Obama's dirty war in Syria and the rest of the story, which we'll get to here. But in other words, for all the 9/11 truthers, you could just as easily be a reverse truther and say that, look, W. Bush and Barack Obama, they were the secret agents of Al-Qaeda. They were doing exactly what our terrorist enemies wanted them to do, which was take the U.S. government's gun and blow our country's brains out.
Just to be clear for people, unintentional agents. So they kind of fell into the trap by Al-Qaeda. I want to go back to something you said earlier, Scott, about the Black Hawk in Mogadishu. Who took credit for that, for shooting that down?
Well, at the time, there was a warlord named Adid, who, of course, W. Bush ended up taking his son's side in the war in 2001 and 2002. And that was what started our current horrible war in Somalia, now America's longest war that no one pays any attention to.
Heartbreaking war.
But yeah, if you read Abdel Bari Atwan, he's a really great journalist, man. The guy's, I've read a lot of crap by a lot of guys. This is a good guy. He did really great work in those days. He went and spent, I believe, 3 or 4 days with Osama bin Laden in 1997 and talked with him all about this stuff. And he says bin Laden complained. He was so disappointed that Bill Clinton pulled out of there. He wanted to fight a war of attrition against us then. And by the way, notice the pure satanic evil of these bin Ladenites, that they don't give a damn how many Afghans or Somalis or Iraqis die in these wars, right? Their idea is, well, whatever, God will sort them out. Even though,
so they were part of that. The Al-Qaeda was part of the Mogadishu group, the group in Mogadishu that shot down the helicopter to try to drag the U.S. into a war in the region.
Right. That's what bin Laden claimed. Yeah.
And how did that lead? And maybe you could here talk about the what is it called? The clear break. What was it? The clean break?
Yes, sir.
The clean break. Yeah, exactly. So how did that war in Afghanistan? So Al-Qaeda was able to drag the U.S. into the war in Afghanistan. How did that become not only a long war, 2-decade war in Afghanistan that ended up Taliban being back in power, but an even, more deadly war in Iraq?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the short answer to that is the Israelis' fifth column, the neoconservative movement. They're the ones who did it, and they did it for Israel. They betrayed us all. Now, real quickly on Afghanistan, I believe, and I make the case in both books, Fool's Errand and Enough Already, that they deliberately let bin Laden escape because they wanted that enemy out there. Who cares if Saddam Hussein was friends with bin Laden if bin Laden's already dead and the American people feel like the war is won? That's what you get for messing with us. We explode you to death and the war's over by Christmas and then everything's fine. And we know from the National Security Council minutes, which they just handed over to Bob Woodward, and Bob Woodward is a liar. So, but I don't think he probably just forged these National Security Council minutes that he quotes in his book at length, in his book, Bush at War, where we know from especially Donald Rumsfeld and his argument, and Paul Wolfowitz with him, his deputy, that maybe first of all, we should not focus on killing only Arabs in Afghanistan. We should focus on regime change against the Taliban. We should not discriminate between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And nor should we discriminate to the American people about who the enemy is in Afghanistan. We're not going to distinguish between the enemy and those who harbor them. Why? Bill Clinton had helped put, with Saudi and Pakistani help, had put the Taliban in power. They didn't care about, they wanted the Taliban in power there because they're basically Saudi sock puppets. What's wrong with that? And so the reason why was just to prolong the war. As Rumsfeld says, he suggested maybe we should start bombing Baghdad now, just so the American people understand this war is not anywhere near almost over. He said, if bin Laden escapes, that is not failure. If bin Laden is killed, that is not victory. And we do not want the American people to get the mistaken impression that we could end this war soon. We want them to know this war is going to last over an extended period of time and over an extended space. So in other words, why did they continue the war in Afghanistan, Mario? Why did they let bin Laden go and then focus on regime change in Kabul? Just because they wanted to go to Baghdad and they couldn't get started on the road to Baghdad for another year and a half. It would take them to build up the forces in Kuwait, and they hoped Turkey to do it. And so they needed to have the war on terrorism as this larger ongoing project so that they could pretend that Iraq had the damn thing to do with protecting the American people from Al-Qaeda. That's the answer.
Funny enough, the nuclear weapons,
So they could go to Iraq.
the nuclear weapons that Iraq had were nuclear weapons that were provided by the US back during the Iran war. A lot of people forget that as well. But just going back to the reason going to Iraq, how does the US benefit? Now you talk about the clean break plan. I'd love for you to break that down for the audience. And I also want to understand how big of a role that played in the decision, because there's multiple factors. From obviously a lot of people talking about Iraq's oil, which doesn't make financial sense alone as a reason. Another one was to really show the world that the US has responded to 9/11 and Afghanistan was just not enough. Another one is the military-industrial complex. Obviously, that's they've got an incentive for more wars, and the clean break plan. I'd love you to break down this, explain what the clean break plan is, and then explain all these reasons of how big of a factor each one played.
Sure. Okay, so here's how I do it in the book, and I think makes the most sense. W. Bush is in charge. So let's start with him. Okay, he's the one sitting in the chair behind the desk calling the shot, not anybody else. So why does he want to do it? He wants to do it because he thinks it's a good way to get reelected. And this is what he told his father in 91. You should go all the way to Baghdad. That way we're still at war during the election 92. So you make sure to get reelected, Dad. And he sided with all the people who said that at the time. And then what happened? His father didn't listen to him, stopped the war short of Baghdad. And then even though he had a great victory, the election was a year and a half later and he lost. And W. Bush said to Miss Mickey Herskowitz, his biographer that he hired, and who they say that they tried to lie and say that this was a lie, but then his father, Bush Sr., hired Mickey Herskowitz again to write the biography of Prescott Bush after this. So I think that's a vote of confidence by Senior in this man's work here. And Herskowitz quotes W. Bush saying, when he's the governor of Texas, if I'm elected president and I have a chance to invade Iraq, I'm going to take it, because that's what a president needs. To be a great president you have to be a war president, and you need an easy war so that then you can get the rest of your agenda through. Okay. And we're talking about W. Bush here. He cannot be subtle. Okay. He just says it in the plainest language of all. Why am I going to do this? Because it'll give me the advantage so I can try to privatize Social Security in my second term. Right? Which, of course, imagine that.
How's war with a country that has nothing to do with the US a good thing for being reelected? How does that make sense? Obviously, being linked to 9/11, anything would make sense, where people are so angry. They need to let that anger out. But
all the great presidents are war presidents, Mario. Now you might say, yeah, but all the worst failures are war presidents too. And I would echo you there. But from W. Bush's point of view, this is what he said. To be a great president, you have to be a war president.
Right? So one is to be reelected. That's reason number one.
That's reason number one. Plus, I think he wanted to show up his dad. People say he wanted to avenge his dad for the plot against him, the fake plot against him of 93. That's possible. I think it's also true that he wanted to show that he was tougher and smarter than his dad, who had flinched and made the wrong decision. He was going to show what a real tough guy does and this kind of thing, and kind of show his dad up a little bit. That seemed to be quite a bit of what was going on there. But then you had Donald Rumsfeld. Now, Donald Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense. He was actually Cheney's mentor. He came first. He was the higher rank guy. He was the one who had been chief of staff and had hired Dick Cheney under Gerald Ford. And they were the ones who, how Bush Sr. had been director of CIA? Well, that was actually Rumsfeld's doing. He had banished Bush Sr. to CIA, because this is right after the scandal of the Church Commission and Operation Chaos and all this stuff. And it was thought by making him the director of the CIA that would prevent him from ever being president, because Rumsfeld wanted to be president, was trying to get Bush out of his way. And he thought that was like tattooing CIA on his forehead so the American people would never vote for him. That's in Andrew Coburn's great book, Rumsfeld. So anyway, Rumsfeld had then made himself Secretary of Defense. And now here he was Secretary of Defense again. Right? He had been under Ford, that is. Now he's Secretary of Defense again. And this is at a time when there was this ongoing argument about the military and its form in the 21st century. The transformation of the military is what they called it. And they had all these competing projects. I remember one time in probably 99, 2000, they had a thing in the Wall Street Journal where it was like the competing visions for how to transform the military and what it should be. And Rumsfeld was very much of the opinion that he wanted to stick it to big army and give their money to the Air Force and the Special Operations Forces, because we're not going to fight a giant land war against Russia and Eastern Europe. So we don't need all those army divisions. We want to be light and fast, do regime changes, and then leave. Let the UN or somebody clean up the mess. But we want to be able to go in there and kick ass, special op, like a Lockheed promo video, right? Lockheed products with special operations know-how on the ground, minimal light and removable forces to get the job done, light and fast and this and that. That was his attitude. And everybody makes such a big deal and a misunderstanding about the speech that he gave on September 10th, where he's out front of the Pentagon. What's he doing? He's saying there's $10 trillion missing, which was not exactly just $10 trillion had been embezzled away, but it was through the absolute poor, piss poor accounting at the Pentagon. They couldn't tell you where 10 trillion had gone. And or was it, I'm sorry, it was 3 trillion. It was September 10th. It was $3 trillion. But what's the point? The point is not that they spent the $3 trillion on September 11th. That's going to happen the next day or whatever these people seem to think. The point is he's beating the army over the head. He's saying the army has wasted this money. So I'm going to give it to the Air Force instead. That's mostly the point of that whole thing. So then that was his point too, what he wanted to do with Iraq. And, exactly what all, I mean, I don't know if the Israelis had anything on him or anything like that, but he was very close with the neoconservatives, seemed to be of one mind with his deputy, Paul Wolfowitz, about all of this stuff, which, leads us to the neoconservatives. Because Colin Powell, he went along, but this was not his project. He was originally against it. Same for Condoleezza Rice. I don't know if she was necessarily against it, but they were on board with the program, but they were not the principals pushing it. Nor was this like CIA's agenda. They go, oh, CIA told us all the weapons. Well, W. Bush strong-armed the CIA into coming up with as much as they could, including they tortured lies out of people in order to implicate Iraq for backing Al-Qaeda. That's not I'm not saying that they're innocent. They told plenty of lies to lie us into that war. Only more narrow point I'm making is that this was not the CIA's agenda that we got to go and get rid of Saddam Hussein now. Right? The former commander of Central Command, Anthony Zinni, he was the same way. Why do we have to do this? We don't have to do this. He actually gave a speech against it, wrote a great article. Was this speech? I think you can still find this. Yeah, I linked to it in my book, where he gave Anthony Zinni, the former head of Central Command. But we don't have to do this at all. So point being that I'm making is that this was not the broad consensus of the American government to do this. This was W. Bush had his reasons, and Donald Rumsfeld had his. And now then Dick Cheney, of course, the vice president, had his. And I think basically what it was he wasn't a very good CEO of Halliburton. And he wanted to in fact, the reason that they had hired him was he had formerly been the Secretary of Defense under Bush Sr. And the idea was he's close with the Pentagon. He can hook them up with a bunch of great construction contracts from the Army and stuff. But it was Democrat times during the 90s, and he didn't really have that much juice at the Pentagon in that way at that time. And so he also bought a company called Dresser Industries that was being found liable for billions of dollars worth of asbestos cancer claims at that time. And now I saw where, I don't know, maybe it was just a comment section on YouTube or something where someone criticized me and said that I give too much weight to that because in fact Dresser Industries was still overall a good investment. That may be true, but it is definitely the case that it was a major scandal at the time that idiot Cheney and his CFO had bought this company and only almost immediately, like a couple of weeks later, realized that they have $1 billion worth of asbestos cancer claims coming in on all these liability suits, and that they had not done their due diligence on this company before buying it, and that it cost them at least $1 billion. I think he had major egg on his face. Now, maybe the comment section guy was right that they had made so much money by the time he became vice president that point was moot. I don't know, but I know that was a big scandal, and I know that one of the first things he did was put Halliburton on the military dole as fast as he possibly could. And I also know that Dick Cheney was at least tied for most eloquent spokesman of why it was wise to not go to Baghdad in 1991, because he said, first, we'd be occupying a hostile country. We'd have to hunt down Saddam Hussein and get him to make sure that he would not be able to take the power back, and that might be a long and protracted effort. Our guys would be fighting in urban warfare combat, getting sniped from, apartment windows, and we would have all the regional neighbors would want to intervene. The Kurds could link up with other Kurds, and that would cause a problem for our friends, the Turks. The Iranians
pretty
might run
accurate.
south. He said, and the Syrians want the West, which that part wasn't really accurate unless he meant the Islamic State later after Obama built it for them. But anyway, so he was saying this was he said, we decided how many more American lives was Saddam Hussein worth? And the answer was not very damn many. And that was the right answer. And he said that numerous times, including on video on C-SPAN in 1994. And so he had clearly changed his mind by the time, not just after September 11th, but by the time he had become vice president of the United States, they were ready to go back over there and go back to war. And we know from Bush's Treasury Secretary, although he later backtracked a little bit, he said the entire subject matter of the first cabinet meeting of the new W. Bush administration was find me a way to do Iraq. And I think, by the way, this is a part of the explanation for why they were so lax on focusing on bin Laden in Afghanistan and the threat of a terrorist attack here was because the neoconservatives were counseling Bush. If we go to Afghanistan, we're never going to get to Baghdad. Don't listen to the CIA. Those guys are going to ruin everything if we do what they want by focusing on this thing. And so that was a big part of
Where does the clear break plan come in?
Okay, so
how big a role do you think that played?
Right. So when I get to the vice president, that's where I get to the neoconservatives, right? Because even though Cheney, of course, was just a conservative Republican and somewhat of a nationalist type, what he did was he hired the neocons. And so go back to, post-war. Who are the neoconservatives? The neoconservatives are a bunch of ex-Trotskyites and Cold War Democrats who then moved to the right and became Reaganites. And they dominated the National Review, the Weekly Standard Magazine, Commentary Magazine, and the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and Washington Post editorial pages of especially Fox News, and all of the think tanks except the Council on Foreign Relations, which they got a lot of influence there now. The Council on Foreign Relations used to be the big one. Maybe it still is the big one, right? Founded after World War I by Morgan interests and then taken over by the Rockefellers. That's the preeminent foreign policy think tank in America. Well, the neoconservatives weren't really allowed there. And I think, this goes back to an earlier time where it was very much like dominated by Brooks Brothers, waspy wasps, Anglicans and Episcopalians and Yale skull and bonesy types, and that a bunch of upper middle class Jews and Catholics weren't really welcome to join their ranks much more than, to a limited degree. But these guys were intellectuals and wonks and extremely interested in foreign policy, in fighting the Cold War against the Soviet Union, and in protecting Israel. And so what they did was they formed an alliance with the military-industrial complex. The military-industrial complex, separate from not entirely separate, but to a degree separate from the old banking and oil interests, they had their own policy. This was the new right, post-World War II new right. And they needed eggheads to write the studies to justify their business practices, right? The military buying weapons from them. So if oil and banking have the Council on Foreign Relations, then Lockheed and Northrop and Boeing, they get in bed with the neocons. And there are these major foundations, the Olin, Bradley, and Scaife foundations, which they seized control over. These are sort of old line conservative foundations. And then once they took them over, they also were able to take over the Heritage Foundation and the American Enterprise Institute, two pre-existing and extremely important conservative foundations. Then from there, they created this whole forest of new ones, including the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, the Project for New American Century,
So
the
many
Center
think
for
tanks.
Security Policy, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs.
So
Right.
they've had influence in all these different think tanks.
Right. These are 100% their think tanks. All this new forest of think tanks are all under neoconservative control. And so, in the Reagan and Bush senior years, they had all got jobs as like, not all of them, but many of them had gotten jobs as like deputy under assistant secretary of arms control, kind of way down the chain. And under Bush senior, his instruction, this would be 1991 through 1990, pardon me, President 1989 through 93. His right-hand man, General Brent Scowcroft, the National Security Advisor, he was under instructions to keep the crazies in the basement. And that meant that they're allowed to kill people down in Latin America, but they're not allowed to mess around with Middle East policy, right? They were somewhat marginalized there. Bush Sr. himself being a very waspy Episcopalian skull and bonesman, right, from the old establishment, and said, keep these guys, the crazies, in the basement. Now, through the Clinton years, they were sort of in exile, but they're running around. They're centered mostly around the American Enterprise Institute, the Project for a New American Century, and the Weekly Standard magazine of William Crystal, the son of Irving Crystal, who had been one of the original Trotskyoids who had helped found this sect. And so they helped to build the consensus. They wrote these letters to Bill Clinton demanding the Iraq Liberation Act of 1998 and demanding regime change there. And then these were the guys that Dick Cheney hired to run the W. Bush administration. Now, okay, I'll get back to that 1 second. Let me do the clean break now. The clean break is written principally by really one guy, David Wormser is his name, but really in conjunction with Richard Pearl. Richard Pearl was known
And
as
Douglas as well, no?
Pardon me?
Douglas Feith as well.
Yes, Feith signed the thing, only he now currently disavows it and said he had no role in its writing and whatever. And so I'll accuse Doug Feith of other things in 10 minutes, but I think this clearly was Pearl and Wormser together were doing this. I think Feith, and there was a guy named Charles Fairbanks Jr. and a couple of others who had signed on to the clean break as well. So I don't want to totally acquit them, but the fact of the matter is David Wormser wrote the damn thing. And Richard Pearl, was his buddy. And I think really Pearl is the boss of the relationship. Pearl is known as the Prince of Darkness and the major he called himself that, and was the major ringleader of the neoconservative mob in DC. So, when Wormser's writing, he's speaking for Pearl. I think I wouldn't want to lump Feith out, but I wouldn't want to lump him into a greater degree than he deserves, because he deserves plenty, but I don't want to, there's no need to embellish what we know he did do. So, but he did sign on to the thing. You're right about that. Now, here's the clean break, okay? And I know this sounds stupid, but it is stupid, and that's why it sounds stupid. It's not my fault.
I'm just looking at the image of the guy. It's like I just want to see the type of person that will just play such a big role. Yeah, exactly. It's such a big role in so many wars, so much death and destruction.
Oh yeah. Now, so people can find both of these articles at scotthorton.org/fair use. And the first one is called A Clean Break, a New Strategy for Securing the Realm. And the follow-up is called Coping with Crumbling States. And they also published a book, a little mini monograph called Tyranny's Ally, America's Failure to Remove Saddam Hussein. And they're all three the same damn thing over and over again, okay? So here's how it goes. Picture a good map of the Middle East in your head now. Iran is a problem for Israel because Iran backs Hezbollah by way of Syria. And now this article, this clean break is being written for Benjamin Netanyahu, not for the Americans. It's being written for Netanyahu when he's the incoming prime minister of Israel for the first time in 1996. And
by this American think tank.
That's right. No, they wrote this for an Israeli think tank, actually. This was not for PNAC. This was for the Israeli Institute for Advanced Strategic Studies or something very similar to that. I'm sorry, I always forget the name of it. But it was for an Israeli think tank, but it was written by these two American neoconservatives, primarily.
Okay.
Now, the argument is a clean break with what? A clean break with Oslo. a clean break with the promise that they're going to negotiate in good faith with the Palestinians and allow there to be anything like a pseudo-Palestinian state under the control of the Palestinian Authority. And they're saying, we're not going to do that. Just like Benjamin Netanyahu told the UN today, 2 states, forget you. Forget being a euphemism there for what he really meant to say, right? That's his same policy from 30 years ago, okay? No way in the world are we doing this. We are stealing this land. Palestinians can burn in hell. We're taking it. That's the Likud doctrine. But there's a problem. Iran backs Hezbollah by way of Syria. And how do we steal Palestine when we got to deal with Hezbollah on our northern flank? And which is a problem for the people who live in northern Israel, have to keep fleeing, and could represent a much a bigger problem later. So if we want to continue grand theft Palestine and forever permanently destroy the Oslo peace process, and then what we need to do is we need to break Iranian power in the region, this arc of Iranian power from Iran to Syria to Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Now, Mario, how do we do that according to David Wormser and Richard Pearl? By focusing on removing Saddam Hussein from power in Iraq. Yeah,
How does that make sense? How's
exactly.
Iranian's historical enemy destroying him would be a way to weaken Iran?
That's right. Secular Sunni Saddam, a 20% Sunni minority, lording it over the 60% Shiite majority that is adjacent to Iran, by the way, in the south and east of Iraq. How does that make sense? America just supported Saddam Hussein for 10 years, basically, through the 1980s to contain the Iranian Revolution.
So
Now,
what's
how
the
is this
answer?
supposed to make sense? Here's how it makes sense if you're an idiot. Well, Ahmed Chalabi, the Iraqi exile, the convicted bank embezzler, and burn spy, the CIA had already put a burn notice on him for his fake, ridiculous coup plot of 1995. CIA wouldn't even work with him anymore. But Wormser and Pearl say over and over again, they say it in A Clean Break, they say it in Coping with Crumbling States, and they say it in Tyranny's Ally. Ahmed Chalabi assures us that this is gonna be great. And what we're gonna do is, if we can do a coup, we will put in a Hashemite king, the cousin of the king of Jordan. And he will then lord it over the Iraqis, and the Iraqi Shiite supermajority, well, they will just bend down and worship a Hashemite king, because a Hashemite king claims to have the blood of the prophet, even though they're Sunnis and even though they're obvious British sock puppets and imposters. Oh yeah, no, the Iraqi Shiite supermajority will worship them and obey their every magic wish and command. This is totally bogus nonsense that Chalabi was pushing, because he was lying to them and they were fools. And they ended up replacing the Hashemite king in their plan with Chalabi himself. What we're going to do is we're going to do a regime change, and Chalabi will be the new dictator of Iraq, and he will work with us, and the new Shiite-dominated Iraq will then be friends with Israel, and most importantly, the Shiite clergy in Najaf, under America, Jordan, and Turkey's thumb, they will tell Hezbollah to stop being friends with Iran, because the Shiite clergy in Najaf, Iraq, they are a higher rank. Remember, Shiite Islam originates in Iraq.
It's trying to make Iran no longer the leader of the Shia Muslims.
That's right.
And they will be able to take away the proxies from Iran. Okay.
That's right. By making Iraq the leader of the Shiite Muslims, but the Iraqi Shiite Muslims under the thumb of the United States and their allies, which is, of course, a ridiculous, idiotic pipe dream. And we already, to fast forward to the end of the story, we already know that when America followed this idiot advice, they ended up fighting an 8-year civil war for the Shiite side, for Iran's best friends, the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq and the Dawa Party. These were the Iraqis who had chosen Iran's side after the Iranian Revolution and when the Iran-Iraq War broke out. They're the same guys who Bush Sr. told to rise up and overthrow Saddam in 91, who then he betrayed and let Saddam crush them. Why? Because, they're coming across the border from Iran to lead the revolution. Oops. And so they let Saddam Hussein crush the revolution. That was the excuse to stay then. And now what does W. Bush do? W. Bush takes Iran's best buddies, Skiri and Dawa, all the way to Baghdad and ensconces them in power. So where David Wurmser wrote that a Shiite democratic Iraq will be a, quote, nightmare for Iran, no, it'll be a nightmare for the United States. It'll be if you talk about a hope for but unexpected gift to bin Laden by driving all the Iraqi Sunnis into violent insurgency, how about a hope for but unexpected gift to the Ayatollah that his buddy Chalabi lied to the American Zionists and convinced them to convince Bush that this is going to be great, man, and it's going to benefit America and Israel both, when in fact it benefited Iran.
Scott, the clean break is there to benefit Israel. I don't understand how it benefits the US. It's weakening Israeli enemies. It's weakening Iran, to weaken Hezbollah, to be able to allow Israel, the argument that you're making, to break away from the Oslo Accords and be able to annex Palestinian territory. If that's the entire goal, and that was written for the Likud party or for the think tank that gave it to Netanyahu later on, how did that become U.S. policy, or at least play a role in the American war in Iraq?
Right. So this is all obviously now central to the thinking of the neoconservative faction in America, that Iraq, and by the way, this is important, Ariel Sharon was prime minister at the time of September 11th and in the lead up to Iraq War II, not Netanyahu. But they were both members of the same party, but they were divided. And one of the main things they were divided about was Iraq and Iran. Sharon hated Iran more. Netanyahu hated Iraq more. And that was the way it always was then. Well, AIPAC in America and the neoconservative movement in America were closer to Netanyahu than they were to Sharon. And after all, W. Bush wanted to go to Iraq. So it only made sense from their point of view that we're going to get the regime change train rolling, and Iraq will be the easiest one to get started, but then we'll have to go to Syria and Iran next. And that's the famous plan, to do the 7 countries in 5 years. And we know that Ariel Sharon said openly, you guys, I support you guys doing Iraq, but you have to do Iran and Syria next. Because at least he understood, if you just get rid of Saddam without doing a regime change in Tehran, well, you're just going to put Tehran's guys in power in Baghdad, which is exactly what happened.
Syria's gone. There's nothing left there. And Iran, everyone's waiting for part 2 of the war.
Yeah.
That's where we are today.
Yeah. So now let me check my clock. Okay, I only got 20 minutes.
Yeah.
So I'll figure out how to say this part faster now. So when Dick Cheney, back to Dick Cheney brings on the neocons. He hires a whole ton of them. So in the vice president's office, he's got Robert Kagan's wife, Victoria Nuland. He's got Scooter Libby, Robert Joseph, and John Hanna. All of them former commies, or, former Cold War Democrats turned right-wing war hawk, pro-Israel Zionist nutcases on the Richard Perle model, all of them, right? On the National Security Council, you have Stephen Hadley, who is Deputy National Security Advisor, but then you also had Zalmay Khalilzad, who was their pet Muslim, who had studied under Leo Strauss at the University of Chicago, was a card-carrying member of their faction. And Robert Joseph, I believe, also was over at the National Security Council. And Scooter Libby was special advisor to Dick Cheney and to W. Bush. Then at the State Department, you had John Bolton, who was actually not an official neoconservative. He's a lifelong right-winger, but was very close to them and their group, and was representing their interests there clearly. And in combination with David Wurmser, and David Wurmser put on 3 different hats in the lead up to the war. He started out at State, where his job was keeping a leash on Powell and his right-hand man, Dick Armitage. Then he went to the Defense Department, where he helped set up the policy counterterrorism evaluation group to come up with lies about Saddam and Osama. And then he went to the vice president's office to help see the whole thing through as Dick Cheney's Middle East advisor. So Wurmser himself was a major ringleader in this whole thing. And then at the Defense Department was the big one, because on the Defense Policy Board, you had Richard Perle was the chairman, James Woolsey, Kenneth Edelman, and Gene Kirkpatrick were all prominent neoconservatives on the Defense Policy Board. Then you had Paul Wolfowitz was the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and Douglas Feith was then the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Policy under Wolfowitz. And Douglas Feith was the one who set up what was called the Office of Special Plans. And so under Feith was then a man named Abram Shulsky. And Shulsky was the one who ran the OSP, and that included all kinds of neocons from the think tanks, most especially from the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, but also just from the Weekly Standard magazine and the rest of these places. So Michael Ledeen and Michael Rubin took part. Elliot Cohen. Oh, I left off Elliot Cohen was also another prominent neocon on the Defense Policy Board. And that reminds me that I left out Eric Edelman and Elliot Abrams, who both were in the vice president's office. And these are the sons of bitches who came up with all the lies about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction that they got by digging through the CIA's trash and by importing lies, funneling, stovepiping in lies from Ahmed Chalabi and his merry group of exiles, the Iraqi National Congress. And they were also the same ones, as I said, Wormser came and worked with a guy named Michael Malouf. And across the hall from the OSP, they set up this thing, the Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group, where they dug through the CIA's trash and came up with lies in order to justify pretending to believe that Saddam Hussein was in bed with Osama bin Laden, so that W. Bush could pretend that there was a threat, that Saddam Hussein was going to take his chemical weapons that he didn't have and give them to his ally, Osama bin Laden, who in fact he was terrified of and had no operational relationship with whatsoever, to do another September 11th, only this time with weapons of mass destruction. We cannot let this gathering danger gather and all these things.
Fear is
Now,
such a
totally
tool. Fear, when there's fear, allows politicians to pretty much do everything, explain anything,
Yeah. And now,
to
so
justify anything.
yep. And now people can search my name and or even Scott Horton Show, all one word, and search x.com and articles, Neoconservatives, Iraq. Because I have a thread on Twitter. You can find it. It's a thread. It begins. The first article in the thread is called Our Hijacked Foreign Policy. Neocons Take Washington. Baghdad is Next by Justin Raimondo at antiwar.com from March of 2002. That's the first one in the chain. But from there, I've got 30 articles all about the neoconservatives and how they lied us into this war, and they lied us into war for Israel, and how they were so damn dumb. They're as stupid as they are murderous with this idiot plot to put Iran's best friends in power in Baghdad and think somehow that that was going to backfire on Iran rather than backfire on Israel and the United States. So then, Mario, this is the answer to your audience's question that they've always wondered then. Why would Barack Obama, we know he did, but why would Barack Obama take Osama bin Laden's side in Syria? And the answer is because W. Bush put the Ayatollah Khamenei up 2 pegs in Baghdad. So now we had to try to take him down 1 peg in Damascus. Remember, the entire problem here was that Iran uses Syria to arm Hezbollah. And so by this idiot Rube Goldberg machine, we're going to somehow turn the Iraq war into the solution to that. Well, that didn't work. Well, let's just focus then eye on the prize. As Wormser wrote in Coping with Crumbling States, after Iraq, we have to focus on expediting the chaotic collapse to Syria so that we could remake Syria in a way better to our liking. In other words, break them away from the Shiites. And so this is why Barack Obama built the caliphate in a treasonous alliance with Benjamin Netanyahu, Recep Erdogan, King Abdullah, and the rest of these kooks back 15 through 10 years ago, when their support for this attempted regime change in Damascus led to the rise of the caliphate that then sacked all of Western Iraq and necessitated the launch of Iraq War III in 2014 through 17, remember, to destroy the caliphate in alliance with the Iraqi Shiites that we wish we hadn't fought Iraq War II for. And Mario, you can double check me, man. I can prove it easily. You literally had Iranian Quds Force on the ground leading the Iraqi Shiite militias to liberate Saddam Hussein's hometown of Tikrit from the Islamic State Caliphate, with American jets flying air cover for Iran, for the Shiites on the ground to destroy the caliphate that America had built to spite the Shiites because we were mad that we fought Iraq War II for them because the Israelis lied us into war.
Jesus.
And I'll tell you a hilarious article to read about this if you want to laugh your ass off. And I admit I got in trouble for this by some people because I know it's embarrassing to say, but whatever, I admit it's not like it's a cover up. The article was originally published at salon.com. And I know that makes everyone think of just whatever woke Antifa idiocy or something like that. But literally, this was 21 years ago that this guy, John Dizard, wrote this article. And John Dizard, who is he? Is he some wokist from Brown University or something? No, he's a real reporter from the Financial Times. He just got paid on a one-off. He was not even a regular writer for Salon. He got paid to do a one-off for them, so he did.
What was the article?
The article is fantastic, dude. It'll kill you. It's called How Ahmed Chalabi Conned the Neocons. And one of Chalabi's, first of all, they quote Douglas Weiss law partner Mark Zell, saying Chalabi is a treacherous, traitorous, spineless turncoat. He promised us that the new Iraq would build an oil pipeline to Haifa, Israel. He promised us the new Iraq would be friends with Israel. Well, he had one set of friends before, and he has an entirely different set of friends now. And that was because Chalabi was now, of course, sucking up with the Iranians and all the people taking over the country in the aftermath of the war. Again, it was his guys who came up with all the lies about the weapons too. So there's Douglas Weiss law partner Mark Zell telling the whole story outright. These are all the lies he told us, and we're such idiots that we believed him, he pronounces at the top of his lungs, right? And then later in the article, and I don't want to get in trouble here, and I don't want to get you in trouble, but I think it's an important quote for the context. We're talking about a quote of a quote of a quote here, so don't anybody get mad at Mario. But I'm just saying, John Dizard, this reporter, went and talked to one of Chalabi's friends in Jordan. And Chalabi's friend says that we asked Chalabi, what are you doing running around with all these Jews? And Chalabi said, I just need the Jews till I can get Washington to launch the war for me. And then I promise I'll stab them in the back after that. So those are not my words. That's what Ahmed Chalabi said to his Jordanian friend about how much respect he had for David Wormser and Richard Pearl and Paul Wolfowitz and Douglas Feith and Abram Shulsky. That these, are my useful idiots. I just need to control their mindless brains and get them to get W. Bush to do what I want. And I do that by making promises about the new Shiite Iraq being friends with Israel and telling Hezbollah to stop being friends with Iran and promising we'll even build an oil pipeline to Haifa as the cherry on top.
Trying to bring back the memories of the Shah.
Yep. And they blew it, man. They blew it. And within a couple of years, they knew it too, and they immediately made a separate deal with the Kurds, so they still get their discount on a barrel of oil anyway. By the way, let me mention here real quick too, that I wrote all about this in my book, Enough Already. And then I got an Amazon review from a guy who said, this book is completely right. And you know how I know? Because I was the viceroy over the oil in the entire Iraq war. And this is the only guy who gets it right about why the neocons wanted to do this for the oil pipeline to Haifa. And it was Michael Maloof from the Policy Counterterrorism Evaluation Group, more than any other, who was constantly on this guy's case to get this done. His name is Gary Vogler. And I ended up publishing his book at the Libertarian Institute. It's called Israel, Winner of the 2003 Iraq Oil War. So when people say that the war was for oil, no, dummy. The war was for oil for Israel.
Look at the Middle East today, Scott. Look how much death and destruction is there. All these countries just have no government, no system.
Millions killed.
No. Yeah. Well, man, it's
37 million people displaced from their homes. 30,000 American veteran suicides. Bin Ladenite terrorism spread from Nigeria to the Philippines. Right? They went from 400 men to 40,000. And now they own their own state. They finally broke out and control their own state in Syria.
shaking hands with Trump yesterday.
It's unbelievable, man. And you know what? I'll tell you one thing that Benjamin Netanyahu said in his UN address this morning that was true, and that is that everything's coming up Likud. Now, maybe they screwed up by the strategic blunder in Iraq War II, but through this current war, they have absolutely decimated Palestinian society on the Gaza Strip. It's probably never coming back. And he said explicitly in a show today, it was so funny. He says, it's not genocide. We're just forcing them all to leave. We're not killing them all. You ever heard of a genocider who invited the population to escape? Well, yeah, that's still genocide. Completely destroy their civilization, drive them off into South Sudan or wherever he wants to do with them. It's insane what he says. But he's right that he's decimated Hezbollah. He killed their charismatic leader, Nasrallah, and has completely destroyed Shiite power in southern Lebanon for what it's worth. He's got a loyal, friendly sock puppet bin Ladenite ruling Damascus instead of an Alawite allied with the Shiites.
Could we see him normalize relations with Syria and Lebanon?
Yeah.
Become a Jordan and Egypt? Okay.
I think so. Well, I don't know. I'm sorry. I cannot quantify just how on the ropes Hezbollah is. I know that Israel has been pressuring the Lebanese government to disarm them, and I'm not sure that the Lebanese government thinks that they can. So, but if they were able
They're definitely
to,
trying.
and if they were able to, then yes, I could see the Israelis figuring out a way to normalize, unless they want to just keep going and steal all the land up to the Litani River.
That's the debate I'm having with a lot of people. I don't think I had an interview with Tom Barak as well about it, and he was optimistic as eyes that Israel's not looking to invade more territory; they just don't need it. The whole goal was from the beginning, West Bank and Gaza.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, they've already taken Mount Hernon in Syria, which is just on the outskirts of Damascus.
Which is bigger than Gaza.
Yeah, and a huge area of land there. And I think, I agree that you don't have the Israeli population to fill the territory, but I think their eyes are bigger than their stomach as far as all that goes. I think if they could, they would like to push the Palestinians out of the entire West Bank, and for that matter, all the Arabs out of Jordan and take all of Jordan, and maybe even start moving down to the Egyptian coast on the Red Sea and all the way to the Euphrates River. I mean, according to some plans for Greater Israel, they own all the land all the way to Kuwait and to the Saudi border. And if they thought that they could get away with doing it through firepower alone, I think that they would. Again,
But things are shifting. Look at the Saudi pact with Pakistan, and obviously Egypt's not as friendly towards Israel at the moment. They're not too happy, and it's important to know that Egypt and Jordan are the second and third biggest beneficiaries from U.S. aid. U.S. As in not U.S. AID, but U.S. actual aid, military aid, excluding the reconstruction fund for Iraq and Afghanistan. Obviously, number one is Israel. But Scott, it's insane just how much you know about all this and how long you've spent studying all this. When did you start doing this? How long has it been?
Well, look, I mean, I've been a very anti-government guy really since I was a little kid, but especially in the aftermath of the Waco massacre and then the cover-up of the Oklahoma bombing, which was supposedly, and I guess to a degree, revenge, but there's a massive cover-up because all McVeigh's friends were undercover FBI informants and flipped states witnesses and stuff, and so the FBI let them all get away with it, and it was the most obvious and absurd and ridiculous cover-up in the world, so that really radicalized the hell out of me a lot back then, and I was a bit of like a New World Order kook and that kind of thing then, the whole plot for a one world government and all that, but
Yeah.
I got cured of that, but so I'm glad, though. I don't regret that because I sure read a lot of really great revisionist history, and I learned a lot about what really happened in the 20th century and the lead up to the 21st here. And then I fell in with the boys from antiwar.com at the start of the war on terrorism. And Justin Raimondo was by far the most important writer in America at that time. Nobody had the Neocons number like Justin. I would encourage all your audience, bookmark the page, antiwar.com/Justin, and just find a rainy Sunday one day and just start in 1999 with the Kosovo War and just read everything Justin wrote through W. Bush and at least through like the first half of Obama. And just speed read it all, whatever. It's so worth it. It's such an education. And I don't think it's a coincidence that it's the Rothbardian libertarians who are the best on foreign policy, because we're the best on everything else too.
Scott, absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time, man.
Absolutely. Thank you, man.
Take care.